Are you curious about discovering ways of making your life better? Then welcome to my podcast. I'm Bob Nickman, and this is The Exploding Human. Listen in while I talk with all kinds of people in the fields of personal growth, health and healing, alternative therapies, psychology, spirituality, environment, and the future. I'm looking for those answers that make life better for everyone. You'll meet cutting-edge practitioners, doctors, artists, filmmakers, business people, and those who have overcome challenges. The brave, the curious, anyone who's out there helping us humans to explore, expand, and explode. Hey, Bob Nickman here. Welcome to the podcast, The Exploding Human. Got an interesting guest today, a gentleman by the name of Attila Hadju, who's doing some very cutting-edge research and work in his company, Stelvio-Oncology, on cancer research. Some of this stuff is a little beyond my comprehension scientifically, but I really enjoyed the interview. He's doing some amazing work. He's got a real passion for this stuff. He's got a long history with the pharmacology world, and he really has opened my eyes to some really interesting cutting-edge kind of cancer stuff that he is doing. So listen into this one. This is Attila Hadju. Thank you. So when I listened to Pete Turner's podcast, there was something you said right in the beginning that stuck out to me, and I want to start there, which is people don't have to die of cancer anymore.
Right.
Tell me what that means, because, for me, when I hear the word, I have this immediate, visceral, I guess, terror is when I hear that word. It's like it makes me so afraid just to hear the word.
Well, it is a terrible, tragic disease for many people. There are, as I said in Pete's podcast, there's no reason why people should be dying from cancer today, especially given the medical advances that we've made, and also the technology we've developed at Stelvio, which is one that is paradigm changing and potentially curative. And so when you look at the overall history of cancer, there's actually a book called The Emperor of All Maladies that describes the history of cancer. And I would encourage people to read that because it goes back to the early days of discovery of different chemotherapies, which were actually derived from the chemical industry, from the paint industry, and also during the First World War, when there were things that were used in warfare that are now being used as treatments. Mustard gas, for example, is actually a derivative of that is used in leukemias today, and it was studied early on. And so how the history of cancer has developed over decades has really been one of whatever is the standard of care plus something else. So what that does is it marginally improves, if at all, the overall survival of patients, because what happens is eventually patients become resistant to chemotherapies, and then they lose response to treatment, and then they have no viable alternatives. So what that means is really a sad state for many people, because that means they have to prepare for the end of life, which is not easy for any of us. And so what that statement meant to say is that today we have at our fingertips technologies and the ability to usher in a new wave of treatments that can be curative. So that's why I'm saying no one should be dying today from cancer. And so, and in particular, our technology, which has the ability to reprogram cancer cells to reverse from a cancer-like state into more of a normal state. And John McCain just died recently of glioblastoma. Let's use that for an example, because that's what we're working on. the overall survival benefit of standard of care, which is surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, gives a patient an additional 2.5 months survival benefit. And that comes at a cost too. The cost is obviously the toxicities associated with chemotherapy, not knowing if you're going to respond or not, because there's no knowledge that once the infusion starts, there's no knowledge that you're going to respond to that chemotherapy or not. The only indication that you have is potentially how long you survive, which is obviously after the fact. So there's no biomarker for chemotherapy, and there's nothing that tells you that, which is where I think many technologies should be heading. The industry needs to shift from incremental or no benefit in survival to cures. And how can we prevent, or how can we delay the onset, or how can we detect certain cancers before they happen? And then, of course, how can we treat those with more curative type of combination treatments, or likely not a monotherapy? And so that's really what I meant by that statement.
Yeah, it's amazing, though. I mean, just to hear that, it made me feel like really hopeful, because it seems like, it's the history of it is that it's just, you hear that word and like, oh shit, it's the end. You hear that, like, that's what you feel like. Even though I know I've had a number of people in my life that have survived various cancers over long periods of time, which is, and I have that evidence, but still, that it's something that's really, kind of like, I mean, they even call it the C word. It's just such a strong visceral reaction to it. So when you say you can take, you're attempting to change cancer cells into a different type of cell, is that what you were saying?
Yes, exactly.
How does that's the work you're doing primarily?
Yes, that's the work we're doing. Yes.
And how is that done?
Well, it's not easy, of course. Nothing worth having is very easy. So how that's done is through a technology called microscopic imaging of the epigenetic landscape. So let's start off with epigenetics. What is epigenetics? So I actually read something on LinkedIn not too long ago that was super exciting, and it just dawned upon me that was a perfect analogy for what we're doing, because when we started explaining molecular biology and our technique, people just, they don't understand it. So what I read on LinkedIn was back in the 80s when a fellow by the name of Bill Gates was trying to explain how you can make software profitable. That was a challenge.
Yeah, I'm sure that sounded like what? It must have sounded kind of insane to people at the time. Now it seems like nothing. But
I know, and so that's what I get when I try to explain what we're doing. So really, epigenetics is the software that controls your DNA and everyone's DNA, because epigenetics exists in every single mammalian cell, eukaryotic cell. It's there. There's no place to hide from it. So it's the software that controls which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off. So we're obviously targeting that in our technology. So what we do is we label epigenetic marks, which exist in every single cell, with antibodies. And so there's only two forms of chromatin. There's open and closed. And so we label the histone methyl groups of chromatin. And what that gives us is an image, a signature, an epigenetic signature that captures the features of the nucleus of a cell. So imagine this image of 500 features which we've labeled, and just imagine if it was the Earth. The nucleus is the Earth, and we're taking pictures of the Earth from a satellite in space, and we're able to see the features such as the valleys, the mountains, the streams, the blades of grass, the trees, the falling of the leaves, the snow, things like that. So there's 500 features in all, and what we do is we take those 500 features and basically compress it into planes or two axes and use machine learning to recognize the patterns. And then the patterns give us a epigenetic signature. So the signature for a cancer cell is very different than a signature from a normal cell. So the core of our technology is cell identity, because we can see what kind of cell is a cancer cell because of its unique signature. And as I said, you can't hide from epigenetics because it exists in every cell. So people ask, well, cancer is heterogeneous. Well, yes, that's why our technology is so powerful, because we're labeling the epigenetic marks which exist in all cells, whether they're heterogeneous or not. So then we were able to screen, basically look for drugs that induce the differentiation, or let's just say reprogramming a tumor propagating cell, which is basically making more cancer cells, reprogram that into a less cancer-like cell or benign cell type. And this happens in stages. It just doesn't happen in one shot. So there's multiple stages of differentiation. So basically it's the reversal of cancer cells into a normal state. So if you imagine a stem cell, this is one of the fundamental secrets of human developmental biology, is how does a stem cell turn into hair or eye or bone or blood? So this is just the reverse of that. So so we start off by asking, well, if cancer is a developmental disease, can we reverse it or reprogram it? And through these small molecule drugs that we're finding, and the way that we're able to do this is we're able to see it. And so we're using live imaging now, combining machine learning with live imaging of epigenetic marks to induce this differentiation. And so we've proven the principle in concept, and we've screened a library of FDA approved compounds, and we found a number of these compounds that do this. So like etoposide, for example. So right now we're working on an etoposide derivative, and that's not going to be the be all and end all. It's just a start. And so if we screen a large novel small molecule library for these molecules that induce this differentiation, we'll come up with novel composition of matter that has value. And then, of course, as I said, there's multiple stages of differentiation that occur. It's just not one shot, and so it'll require likely multiple drugs through multiple stages of differentiation. And this has been documented in the scientific literature. This is not something we just dreamt up one day, and so it's been documented that there's certain biologicals that can induce this to occur in the petri dish. So we thought, well, we can just mimic these biologicals with small molecule drugs instead, because you can't give a glioblastoma patient a biological. It's just not. You have to get it somehow to the site of action and through the blood-brain barrier, and that's not easy. So you have to have something that penetrates the blood-brain barrier, and so you need a small molecule. And so that's why we have used this approach. And there's certain things like bone morphogenic protein and serum, even just serum that you use in tissue culture has induced this, and this has been documented in the literature. So that's sort of where our approach was conceived. So yeah, we're making some good progress, and we're hoping that the hard part is actually raising the financing because everyone is saying, great, you've got this technology, you've shown it in vitro, so where's your drug?
Well, we need it Thursday.
Yeah, where's your drug? So that's the challenge. So we're because we're at the stage where VCs are I would say, even though that's theirs, in my opinion, if I were a VC, that's what I would be trying to do, is trying to find the next Google or the next
Sure.
um, but the reality is there aren't that many Googles and Apples. So, but the reality is they're also VCs are very risk averse. So they want something like that's as de-risked as possible with the greatest upside as possible. As you can imagine, those are opposite ends of the scale.
Yeah, it's like nobody wants to be first and nobody wants to be second. It's kind of
Well,
it's kind
it,
of like that. Yeah.
it's like that, but the reality is, if you're gonna invest some in early stage, there's obviously the greatest amount of impact, but also the greatest amount of risk.
Yeah.
And on the opposite side of the coin, if you're going to invest in something late stage, there's obviously much less risk. There's still risk, but obviously very low upside. So I get these questions that I can't imagine how to answer them. But show me your clinical trials, for example, of how you think this will work. And my response to that is, well, the only clinical trials are for in glioblastoma are for temozolomide, which is an approved drug. And so clinical trials in humans, people are asking for clinical trials in humans, and I'm like, well, if I had that, then it would be an approved drug.
You guys are like on the edge of the frontier with this stuff. I mean, it's
It
really
is. Yeah, it
exciting.
is.
I mean, takes a lot of courage and a lot of belief and a lot of hope and a lot of smarts too, obviously. I mean,
All those things. Yeah.
yeah.
So what we need now, the missing ingredient now is obviously someone to believe in it with deep pockets. So we do have one investor that's committed $1 million. That's Torrey Pines Investments. And so they've committed $1 million. And so there are certain things that we need to fulfill. And obviously $1 million is not going to get us to where we want to go. So we're looking to raise closer to $8 million. And so we've engaged with several groups right now to help us. Basically, three in particular that will hopefully help us find those investors, because I've personally that's been something I've been focusing on, and I've realized now that it's something that we need help with, and we're reaching out to people that can institutions that can help get those institutional investors, bring them on board, and see where we go from there. And I've reached out to my old contacts that I've been in big pharma for over 18 years and in various leadership roles. And so I went back to my former contacts, and I've asked them, listen, we've worked together before, let's work together again,
Mm.
and let's try to tackle this thing. And so yeah, that seems to be gaining some traction. And we're also a Johnson & Johnson Innovation J Labs company. So that's helped somewhat, because obviously that opens doors if you have that network. And Johnson & Johnson also like to be aware of what their resident companies are doing, and they obviously have the resource. So we're working with them to basically develop novel composition of matter IP, and that's the real value for a pharma company is novel IP, which is composition of matter and or method of use IP that they can actually turn into a drug.
What does IP stand for?
Intellectual property.
Oh, okay. Now I know.
Sorry, I don't like using acronyms either, and people use them on me.
Well, if I don't know, I mean, you're in a field that it's way above my pay grade, and I'm so happy that people are doing this. I'm not a scientist or any of that stuff. I'm just somebody that wants to find out about what kind of amazing stuff is coming down the road, and that's why I wanted to do this. And here's another question: when you say a molecular drug, what does that mean as opposed to something
Yeah,
else?
sorry. So So there's really a lot of exciting technologies in the world that are. So the best way to think about it is just like a small molecule drug is something that acts that has a certain mechanism of action, a biological mechanism of action. So let's just say, for example, let's use asthma. Right, everybody knows what asthma is. So asthma is inflammation of the airways, right? So you inhale a puffer, and that's a small molecule that acts on your airways that causes dilation of your airways. So you know what that does, right? It's a small molecule.
Yeah, it
So
expands that area so you can breathe.
it breathe. So there's other ways that you can elicit a biological response. You can use biologicals, and you can use gene therapy. You can use like CRISPR, which is everyone's talking about lately. You can use like take your own body cells, take them out of your body, re-engineer them, and put them back in, and that's called CAR T cell therapy, which is a chimeric antigen receptor that works on the body's T cells so that your own body can fight cancer. So there's a number of different ways that you can tackle diseases. So that you can use antibodies, which are proteins really targeting against specific diseases. You can use vaccines, or you can use viruses that attack the cancer. Small molecules are just like the example I used with the asthma example. They're just tiny molecules that work
Mm-hmm.
within a biological process in the body that elicits a biological response. And the mechanism of action, that's the key to what we're doing. Is if we figure out how, and that's a good question that you asked, is if we figure out how a cancer cell reverses itself into a non-tumorigenic cell, we figure out that mechanism. That's pretty powerful.
It sure is. Do you use plants? I've been reading a little bit about some of the plants that some of the pharmaceutical companies are recognizing as having healing properties. Sort of going back to, instead of these harsh chemicals like you were talking about, like mustard gas, actual plant therapies that drugs are.
Aspirin was developed from the bark of birch tree bark. And so plants have very powerful medicinal capabilities, and that's one of the I suppose it's a sidebar, but I think the fact that the earth gives us such a resource to use, and as I would say a resource to use for vast array of potential healing sources. And so it would be, and we're cutting down the trees and things like that. I mean, that's just so. The short answer to the question is no, we're not using plants, but these derivatives or these small molecules that we're using may come from a plant. They're just chemicals. They're just chemicals that are existing, and they may have come from biomimicry is a very powerful tool as well. And that's basically using nature to solve problems. Like, people have figured out how to get spider webs into fibers, because the spider's web is one of the strongest materials on Earth, and it's also flexible, and so things like that. And so so the short answer is we're not actually taking plants and mushing them up and extract, but somebody's already done that and then put those chemicals that have potentially come from plants into a small molecule library, and then we're using that chemical library to screen for novel compounds which may have come from plants.
Oh, that's really great. It's
Yeah,
amazing how it must be just thousands and thousands of pieces of information to sort through. Obviously, there's computers
yeah.
involved.
There's million. There's actually millions. I mean, some of these compound libraries are in the millions, and so you think about the combinations of compounds and that they're out there, and each drug company has their own proprietary chemical library, and that's one of their most valuable assets. And so, because they've got a compound library of all these things, and so that's what we're hoping to unlock the power of some of those mechanisms, and obviously towards fighting cancer.
how many? Now, your company is called Stelvio,
Stelvio, yes.
and if people want to visit your website, is it stelvio.com?
It's a little bit longer than that. So Stelvio-Oncology.com.
Okay. I went on the website. I couldn't remember the address, but I was kind of looking
Yeah.
through it, and check it out, people. If you're listening to this, it's amazing work. How many people are you working with on this, and you're just in your little piece of the company?
Well, there's several. There's obviously we have a I'm the CEO of the company, and I founded it, and we have a chief scientific officer. His name is Alexei Tursky, who's an associate professor of neuroscience at Sanford Burnham Medical Discovery Institute in San Diego, California. And then we have a group of advisors. One's an expert in machine learning. His name's David Andrews, and also a medical oncologist, hematologist. His name's David Spanner. And then we have obviously we have a number of scientists that have been involved in the technology for years. Alexi's been involved in this field for a dozen years or more, and so lots of experience. We have a lot of collaborators, and we're working on collaborations with several people. So the reach is quite large, although our company right now is quite small. And obviously, when we secure some funding, then we need to hire some very key people, mainly some scientists, to accelerate this work. And the big advantage with our company is that we have a fully operational lab, and so we're working with through a corporate sponsored research agreement through Sanford Burnham, which is quite exciting because typically startups don't have access to $100 million high throughput screening facility like we do. And the reason we do is because we're internal at Sanford Burnham, and through this agreement, we're able to utilize a fully operational lab versus have to go out and buy a piece of equipment that a lot of startups do. So we're very capital efficient that way, and advanced in many ways. And so that's what has enabled us to get some traction with these early investors, and hopefully bring in additional funding.
I'm so glad. I mean, we had to postpone the podcast twice because you had investor meetings. I was happy to hear that. That made me feel good. I go, people are
Yeah,
interested. Yeah.
they've been working hard on that, and I know that we've had some luck getting some new groups to join us in our fundraising efforts, and so that takes some time. And there's a group in China, and there's a group in New York, and there's another group in the U.S. that we're working with, and now, so that's going to hopefully get us to where we want to go. But it always takes time, and there's a lot of rescheduling involved.
What would you say, as a scientist, are the causes of cancer, the main causes? I'm looking at the prevention side of it for a second, and maybe I know that's not exactly what you're doing, but as somebody who's on the sort of solving the problem end, what's going on at the onset end?
That's a really good question. I actually was just reading something this morning about happiness. What what is happiness? And to me, I think if you were to ask me, I would say basically it's the quality of our human relationships. Which is, I mean, you have loving relationships with your family, your friends, and I mean, you can't really beat that. There's no way. And obviously, if you're healthy, or conversely unhealthy, you're not very happy. And so the first thing that comes to mind when you ask, that's a very good question. When you ask that question is what causes it? What we do know scientifically that causes cancer is smoking cigarettes. For sure, we know that causes cancer. And the second one that I can think of that I've been involved with in the past is human papillomavirus is known to cause cervical cancer. So there's now two direct causative agents, if you will, that have been linked to cancer. So now there's other things that we think may impact certain cancers, like obviously ultraviolet radiation has been linked to skin cancer. And so that's where the importance of using sunscreen. So, and then there have been a number of different studies. And again, these things seem to change over time depending on who does them. And, there's this literature behind this red meat causing cancer, and, whether that's true or not. So clearly there's some things that are environmental, that in nature, that we are exposed to as humans, that cause certain diseases like cancer to happen. Obviously our diet, what we do, what we eat and what we drink. So this article I read this morning talked about happiness, and it's like, well, don't drink and don't smoke. I mean, that seems very simple, but yeah, we know that smoking for sure causes cancer. I'm not quite so sure about the alcohol part, but yeah, it's what we eat and what we do, and the certain environmental stimuli like UV radiation, we know, and then but the rest of it's also mutations that you're born with, that you have no choice in the matter. That sometimes you have a predisposition, you have your genetic background. So I go back to my early science training, and it's half of it's environment, and half of it's your nature versus nurture. So half of it's your own genetic material. And in order to have something like a breast cancer forming, you have to go through decades of mutations in your DNA for that cancer to form. And people have actually published groups that have published on all of those mutations that have occurred through someone's lifetime in order for someone to develop a breast cancer. So, which is very fascinating, and so and that's what we're hoping to be able to reverse, is if we can understand what the software that controls those mutations to occur, like through the epigenetics and the imaging, then perhaps we have a solution for those people.
That would be just the most amazing thing, because it's I know there's a lot of advances already, but I just would love to see somebody getting a diagnosis and knowing that they're going to be okay, like as soon as they get it. If you get pneumonia and you get on it pretty quickly, an antibiotic's probably going to knock it out. You know that for the most part. But this is not that. It's I was sort of curious when you were talking about happiness. I thought, is that something in itself that's a cancer preventative? I know there's been some, it's way probably out of what you do, but I'm sort of interested in like attitude and, what the body is doing when it's happy, in terms of the immune system and fighting things. Or am I getting too out there woo-woo?
No. It's actually a really good point. I'm glad you raised it, because Basically, what I see is if let's just say someone gets a diagnosis of cancer, then you have to have hope. You have to have hope that there is that you're going to get better, you're going to do better, you're going to have support from your family. Because if you just throw your hands in the air and say, well, I'm not going to fight this thing, I'm just going to resign, then there's a different attitude, as you said. So there are people that are fighters that say, I'm going to fight this thing, and then there could be some clinical trial that comes along. Maybe it's a novel treatment, and you get randomized into this clinical trial that has an experimental drug that you're going to get tested on. Hopefully, you get the active treatment arm, and then this treatment actually works. And if you don't have hope, and you say, well, I'm just gonna like call it quits. And so the attitude means a lot. I mean, you're that's something you can control. Everyone can control. We can control our own attitude every day we wake up. That's something we have full control over. And so whether you choose to fight a disease, if you have it, is your own doing. And so I think that your family structure, your support structure, that means a lot, because that's really why we named Stelvio is because it is a lot like it comes from the Italian Dolomites. The Stelvio Pass is a famous mountain in the Italian Dolomites, but it is a mountain to climb for people. And the whole idea behind it is that there's no mountain it's too big for us to climb together. You have to have a support structure. You have to have physicians. You have to have allied healthcare workers. You have to have family, friends, community behind you, and so it means a lot. And because it's not easy to get yourself to a clinic and have someone put in an IV and go through that. If that's and so there's a lot that needs to be done emotionally and so yeah, I think the happiness part is very big, and it gives people hope to continue fighting. That there may be a novel treatment that comes along that could help them, and so that means a lot.
Yeah, I'm just sort of blown away by all this new stuff like stem cells. I just interviewed a guy who had some stem cell treatment in Panama.
Mm-hmm.
It's not what the stuff they're doing there hasn't been approved in the United States yet, but they use I guess they call them undifferentiated stem cells as
Yeah.
opposed to the ones that are assigned to
Yeah.
hair, nails, whatever. So he had a heart condition, and he seems to be it's a couple of months, but he's different. I mean, it's just he said he also had arthritis in his toes. He said he can bend his toes now. They injected some of the stem cells there and in his hip, and did some IV kind of treatment. I don't know if that's, I know they're doing some stem cell stuff here in the United States, but this was sort of on the more experimental edge of it. Pretty interesting. I don't know if that's something that's going to help with cancer or not, but it sounded pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, that's the same idea as what we're working with, right? Is we like to call it tumor propagating cell, which is basically a cancer stem cell.
Oh, okay. All right.
So it's just the reverse of that. So basically, what we're doing is a cancer stem cell. Basically, the way it divides is called symmetric division. So basically, it's a cancer stem cell dividing to make another cancer stem cell, and that's by definition, cancer is uncontrolled growth of abnormal cells that don't die. So these cancer cells are basically immortal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what causes tumors. And if you look at a glioblastoma, for example, it starts off as a primary tumor, which is an important distinction to make. There's primary and secondary tumors. So primary tumors are where they originate. Secondary tumors are where the cancers metastasize. So a primary tumor like a glioblastoma starts off in the brain, and it just grows because those cells don't die. And obviously, that's what eventually kills the patient. So if you can take those cancer stem cells and induce them to divide by a mechanism called asymmetric division, which means they divide into a normal cell that can die. So let's just say it starts off as a glioblastoma cancer stem cell,
Yeah.
and you're inducing it somehow through this small molecule that we found to divide into.
Now I get it. When you said change it into a cell that can die, that made me understand it right there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It can die. It's a normal cell that can die, because you look at your skin cells and your nails. I mean, those are cells that turn over all the time.
Yeah, right, all day long.
But with the cancer, those cells are immortal. They don't die. They form tumors, and then they metastasize and they spread to other parts of the body. So you need to turn those cells into cells that can die, that maybe are resistant, but that are not resistant anymore to treatments.
I completely get that. I was sort of still, my mind is, as you're talking, I'm trying to figure out, I mean, this
That's
is
good
like,
you asked that question.
Yeah, I was happy about that. So now the next time you're interviewed,
Yeah.
well, Bob got it when I said this, so maybe you got that.
Yeah.
Now, how are you testing your products,
Well, they'll have to go through the typical route, which starts off as obviously discovery is the very early stages where we are, and then goes into preclinical, which you modify the compound through some chemistry work and animal data, and then basically, if you can show that you're flattening these tumors in animals, then you move into what's called investigational new drug status. So that typically takes a couple years, and so then our funding is tied to those milestones. And if we get to investigational new drug status, then the next step is phase 1 studies, which are typically safety studies.
Mm-hmm.
Dose escalate until you see toxicity, and then that gives you some safety data, and then you move on to phase 2 data, which is still safety. So the phase 2, I've seen drugs approved on phase 2 data, which is very powerful. But what that means is that there's nothing for these patients as an alternative. So the data that companies have submitted or results from the phase 2 data have been approved by the FDA in some cases. And this is a big advantage if this is something we can do, because obviously phase 3 trials are very expensive. They require a lot of patience, a lot of time, and a lot of money. So to get that approval, and that's typically what the FDA uses in terms of approval for drugs is positive phase 3 data, obviously. And those are trials that take years. And
it's like 10, 15 years, it sounds like, for the whole process. If you're
hopefully not that long, but that's what we're trying to accelerate is through our machine learning technologies. I think this is where China is becoming, I would say, they've realized that there's a gap in accessing medications. If you look at the top 50 medicines, the innovative medicines in the US, they don't have access to those medicines in China. Like, they have access to maybe 3 of them.
Okay.
And so, do you know how many patients die from lung cancer every day in China?
No clue, but I know the air is terrible there.
7,000 people die every day from lung cancer in China. And you're right, it's because of the air. You think about the pollutants and the carcinogens that leak into the drinking water, things like that. So artificial intelligence, machine learning is accelerating drug discovery, and that's what we're doing. And so we're hopefully able to solve a big problem in other parts of the world. And I'm not have you been to China? I mean, it's a pretty fascinating place.
I have not, but I have talked to several people that have lived there, and what they tell me, there's not a lot of rules in terms of the environment. So there's, and it's pretty much, dirty air and water, like you were talking about. But I don't know about any of the other stuff. They were just telling me about sort of how they do business there, and the lack of regulation on environmental stuff. But I don't know if that's where you were going to be talking about.
Well, I think it touches on that. I think that the issue there is that there are environmental pollutants, like you said, the air, for example, and that we talked about lung cancer and smoking, right?
Yes.
So we know what effect that has on lung disease, and 7,000 people are dying every day. So from lung cancer, and that's a lot.
It sure is a lot.
And then those people don't have access to medicine. So that's what we're trying to do, is solve those problems. I don't know if I have enough time in my lifetime, but if there's something I could do, and I tell my kids this, if there's something they could do to help with things like climate change or things like pollution in the environment. I mean, they're already changing. They're coming home from school saying, "Dad, we need to walk to school and ride our bikes more." They're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting thing how, the earth in itself is obviously a living organism as an earth, as a thing, and you start messing with that, it's going to fight back in a sense, it's going to act the way it acts, and there's nothing human beings can do to go if we go against nature. Nature's going to act a certain way. If we go with nature, then it'll act in the way that it's intended. If you're throwing trash in a river, it's going to get polluted, and then you're going to drink that water and you're going to get sick. Now, if you treat it in a different way, then it won't. So, it seems a pretty simple formula, yet there's a lot of people driven usually by greed and a need to, there's sort of an attitude about conquering nature rather than living with it and understanding that we're a part of it.
Well, that's just it. I mean, you've accurately described homeostasis and the balance of nature. I mean, things are. I mean, the birds and the bees all have their role, and pollination, things like that. I mean, those are all nature's a delicate balance, and once you start disrupting that balance, then of course you're going to get disease and sickness, and yeah, you're right. It's driven by greed. It comes down to profit. So, and nature has a value. Nature has the value of the air, the value of the water, the value of the resource. If you account for those, that's got trillions of dollars of value. If you account for those into production of your products, then those products should, in theory, be more expensive. And that's where I think people are going we're talking about carbon taxes. We're talking about, if you actually accounted for the value of nature, like the value of taking that water out of that river to use it in your factory,
Right. Think it through.
to sell your product, that's going to cost, and then you're basically dumping in sewage in return. Yeah, think it through. I mean, so I think the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues we have to seem to solve is air travel. There's no way in our lifetime we're going to come up with an alternative way to provide fuel for airplanes. It's not going to happen. So for now, it's going to be fossil fuels, but the airlines. I mean, we didn't come up with. You and I didn't come up with that problem. I think whoever came up with air travel and commercialization of air travel didn't actually account for how they're going to clean up.
Yeah, they probably didn't think about it for 1 second when it was starting. I wouldn't think.
Well, I think they knew. I mean, scientists knew if you actually dig a fossil fuel out of the ground and you combust it, it's going to produce these chemicals. they knew, and they actually knew that these chemicals can actually warm the atmosphere because it's basically putting CO2 into the air, which blocks the escape of ultraviolet radiation, which basically causes the greenhouse. They knew that.
My point is that the scientists knew it, but the people making money didn't want to know it. They don't
Well,
want. They don't want to know it. They don't want to see it. They don't want to look at it.
Right.
Because they don't even think that these people not have children and grandchildren they care about. Apparently not.
Well, they do, but they do, which is the surprising thing, because we're passing on this on to future generations. I mean, there's going to be 10 billion people by 2050, and how are those people going to eat? Where are they going to drink?
Oh boy, this is going to a dark place, Attila.
You asked the questions.
I did. I'm hopeful that that there's one quality of humanity that I've always embraced, which is resilience.
Right.
And that when we're backed into a corner, I do have faith that there's enough of us that can invoke some kind of a change for the better. That's so I sort of have my elbow resting on resilience, and I'm always looking for that. That's one of the reasons I want to do this podcast. I want to get positive a message out there that people are doing great work like yourself, and that there's a lot of hope.
Well, that's the silver lining. I mean, the silver lining is really that there's hope, and then we're doing some great work. We're trying to fight cancer, and that's what drives me in terms of passion is I want to fight for these cancer patients that have a better. I mean, really, it's creating a better future for our kids is my sort of my own personal philosophy. It's not just my kids; it's everyone's kids. So as you can tell, I think about these things, and it means a lot to me. And so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing versus something else. So that's the bottom line. You said it right there. And so, there's we have to hope for a better future in all areas, right? Whether it's the environment and healthcare and all these things, and yeah.
Well, thank you for doing what you do. I'm so glad to have gotten to talk to you, and
yeah, likewise. I'm glad to
share your passion here for an hour. It's been great. I mean, it's just very important work you're doing. You should be really proud of yourself, which I'm sure you are. And Stelvio-Oncology is the website.
Correct. Stelvio-Oncology. Yes.
Okay, so people listening, check it out. Attila Hadju, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for listening in. I'm Bob Nickman. Please come back, check out The Exploding Human in the next episode. Okay, thank you.